Wait a second. Are zombies real? When Jesus died and was resurrected, did people literally come out of their graves like zombies and walk down the street? I don't feel like I can do anything until I figure out if this is true or not. Hi, and welcome back to Learn the Bible with Nathan, where we build a relationship with Jesus one chapter at a time. Today we're going over Matthew 27. It's the second to last chapter in the book of Matthew. And we're going to be addressing many questions in today's episode, including a secret behind the man who carried Jesus' cross, biblical and non-biblical evidence for why the world went mysteriously dark for 3 hours, and by the end of the episode we will address the question on whether or not when Jesus died and was resurrected, zombies came out of the ground. This is exciting. And we're going to start this episode by reading verses 1 through 31 together. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it is called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy a potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked him, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew that it was out of self-interest that they handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It's your responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus to the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. They knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him and took a staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. This is the word of the Lord. All right, now in the first half of this chapter, the religious leaders hand Jesus over to Pilate, who is the governor of that region. Judas Iscariot is overwhelmed with guilt, and that's why he returns the 30 pieces of silver that the teachers of the law gave him to betray Jesus, and then he goes and hangs himself. Pontius Pilate questions Jesus, but then finds no fault in him. But the crowd is insistent that he gets crucified. Pilate offers to free Jesus, the one who's called the Messiah, or Jesus Barabbas instead, and the crowd sides with Barabbas. Pontius Pilate washes his hands of the situation, and then Roman soldiers take Jesus away to mock him and beat him before crucifixion. Now, before I go any further, this is a super heavy chapter, because this is the chapter where Jesus is crucified. Now, other gospel books go into more detail about Jesus' crucifixion itself, so I'm not going to go into that detail in this episode. Instead, I'm going to address some of the things that happened around Jesus when he was being crucified. Okay, so let's dive into this. Now, we remember from last chapter that Jesus was already tried by the elders and the teachers of the law, and he was found guilty. So why now is he being tried again by Pontius Pilate? The reason for this is because the Israelite leaders at the time did not have the authority to execute people. So Jesus was already found guilty in a Hebrew court, but in order for him to be executed, he had to be found guilty in a Roman court. Hence why he's on trial with Pontius Pilate. And as we just read, Pontius Pilate finds no guilt in Jesus. And then before he sends him away, he washes his hands. What's significant about Pontius Pilate washing his hands? Washing your hands is a way of declaring that you are not guilty of something. And this is a deep Jewish tradition. In Deuteronomy 21, which is in the Old Testament, Jewish leaders would wash their hands when there was a murder, but they couldn't find who the killer was. This is symbolic of the leaders saying that we do not carry the guilt for this murder because we tried to find the murderer, but we couldn't find him. So it's interesting here that Pilate is washing his hands when saying that he can't find guilt in Jesus. Remember, Pilate is not a Jew, he's a Roman. So this gives us more of an insight on how Pilate went above and beyond to say, you, teachers and leaders of the Jews, are at fault here, not Jesus. Pontius Pilate is saying that he's innocent, and he's saying it in a way that every Jew will understand, by washing his hands. Now, after Pontius Pilate does this, the crowd responds with one of the craziest phrases in the entire Bible. They say, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Now, some scholars believe that the reason why Jews have experienced so much anti-Semitism over the last 2,000 years is because of this statement that these people made right here. However, that claim is not supported by Scripture, so I personally don't hold that belief, but either way, probably something you should not be saying. All right, now moving on. When Pontius Pilate offered to release a prisoner, he offered to release Jesus, who's called the Messiah, or Jesus Barabbas. Now, there's two really interesting things about this Jesus Barabbas guy. Now, when I read this story when I was young, I thought it was crazy that the crowd was willing to release a crazy murderer in Barabbas and not release Jesus. Like, how insane would this crowd have to be willing to release a murderer? But actually, it's not as crazy as you think when you look a little closer. Jesus Barabbas was considered a murderer under Roman rules, and he was up for crucifixion in the same way Jesus was. Now, I'm not saying that murder is common, but common murder would not get you crucified in this day and age. But yet Barabbas is about to be crucified. So what can we deduce from this? Most likely, Jesus Barabbas was a zealot, meaning he was a Jew that tried to overthrow the Roman government. So yes, he was considered a murderer from a Roman perspective, but from a Hebrew perspective, he was probably widely considered a hero. So when the Jews chose to release Barabbas instead of Jesus, this is not a harebrained move, and it's not putting the Jewish people at risk, because most likely Barabbas was well loved by the Jews. Now, another thing that's interesting about Barabbas is his name itself. Remember, Jesus is the Son of God. And the name Barabbas means son of the Father. Bar means son, and Abbas means father. So the comparison here in this theme is very interesting. We've got two sons of the Father, but Jesus preached a ministry of peace. But Barabbas the zealot, his philosophy would have been to overthrow Rome, which is what most people wanted the Messiah to do. But Jesus, being the Messiah, taught something totally different. Really interesting compare and contrast there. All right, now let's continue by reading verses 32 through the end of the chapter together. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed a written charge against him. This is Jesus, King of the Jews. 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads, and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He is calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar and put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks split, and the tombs were broken open. The bodies of the holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Many women were there watching from a distance. They followed Jesus from Galilee and cared for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea, called Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body and wrapped it in clean linen cloth and placed it in a new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was alive, the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people he has risen from the dead. The last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make a tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made a tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. All right, so Jesus is led to Golgotha. And then Simon of Cyrene is chosen to help him carry his cross. While Jesus is being crucified, he is mocked by literally everybody around him, including the prisoners who were being killed next to him. And just before Jesus dies, he experiences some deep anguish. And as a result, the temple curtain is torn in two from top to bottom, there are earthquakes, and there's a blackout for 3 hours. And all of these events made people flee, and even the Roman centurions believed that because of these events, Jesus was in fact Son of God. Then Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus and buried him in his own tomb. And the teachers of the law were concerned that Jesus' disciples were going to steal his body and make claims that he rose again. So they sealed the tomb and they posted soldiers out to watch. All right, let's dive into this, starting with Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross. Now, Cyrene is a city in northern Africa that had a large Jewish population. So Simon was most likely in the area to celebrate Passover. Now, Roman law allowed centurions to take any Jewish citizen and make them carry things on their behalf. You might remember this from Matthew chapter 5. Now, here's the interesting thing about this Simon of Cyrene fella. Not in Matthew, but in the book of Mark, the author gives a little extra detail about this Simon guy. He says that Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus. And in Romans 16, this Rufus guy appears again as one of the leaders of the church. So quite possibly a guy who was forced to do hard labor on behalf of Jesus, his family goes on to be one of the early leaders of the Christian church. What a small world. Now the next part that I want to focus on is in verse 45. There was darkness that spread throughout the entire land. Now I want to know whether or not that literally happened or if that's some sort of a figurative metaphor. Biblical skeptics might say that this event happened because of a solar eclipse. But we know that Jesus was crucified during Passover. And we can trace back when this Passover actually took place, and there was no solar eclipse in the area. Not to mention, Passover always happens during a full moon. So explaining this darkness by a solar eclipse is astronomically impossible. Now, something that is cool about this event is that obviously the Bible talks about this darkness, but non-biblical historians talk about the darkness as well. Some of the most famous first century historians like Thallus, Phlegon, and Tertullian all wrote about a mysterious 3-hour darkness that nobody can explain. I probably butchered the pronunciation of those names, but that's okay. You forgive me. So to answer my question, yes, this 3-hour darkness did literally happen, both verified by biblical and non-biblical historical accounts. Now the thing that's interesting about this darkness is that the festival that's being celebrated when Jesus is crucified is Passover. And Passover is a holiday used to celebrate when the Jews were freed from Egypt. And the Passover is in reference to when the death angel came and killed all the firstborn of the Egyptians, but they passed over the Hebrew houses because there was the blood of the lamb on their doorpost. And when the death angel came, the land went totally black. So there are a lot of parallels here. In both scenarios, the land goes black. In both scenarios, a lamb was used as a sacrifice. Back in Exodus, it was literally a lamb, and in Matthew, it was the Lamb of God. The similarities in both scenarios is certainly not accidental. All right, next let's talk about how the veil in the temple tore in two. Now, a couple key takeaways here. Jesus talks throughout his entire ministry that in the new covenant, people are going to be able to have direct access to God by having a relationship with Jesus in their hearts. Now, in the old covenant, it wasn't that way. In the old covenant, only within the temple and within the Holy of Holies that was separated from the rest of the world using this giant veil, only in that place was God able to reside. I shouldn't say able to reside, I guess it's the only place he decided to reside. So when Jesus dies and the veil is torn, that is certainly symbolic of the fact that God no longer has to have distance between him and us. Because of what Christ did, he bridged that gap. Now, the last thing that I'll say about the veil is the fact that it was torn from top to bottom. Some skeptics might say that people went into the temple and tore the veil on Jesus' behalf. But that would have been impossible to do for several reasons. Firstly, this veil is not like a shower curtain. It's incredibly thick cloth. It's about as thick as a man's hand. That's how thick the veil is. It's also about 60 feet tall. And the veil was torn from top to bottom. So this literally would have been impossible for a human being to do unless he had a 60-foot ladder and the world's largest pair of scissors. Okay, now on to the last question. When Jesus died and was resurrected, did the saints literally wake up from the dead and walk on the streets? Were there literally zombies walking the streets when Jesus died? When it comes to what actually happened here, there's two different trains of thought, and I'll try to describe them both to you. The first train of thought is that this did not literally happen. It's a figurative statement, meaning that people now, when they die, they can get resurrected as Jesus is resurrected. And there's some pretty decent evidence to back this up. The first evidence is that this account of people raising from the grave and walking down the streets, it only appears in Matthew. It doesn't appear in Mark, Luke, or John. And secondly, those ancient non-biblical historians who all account for the blackout, none of them account for people being raised from the dead and walking down the streets. Now, it's not clear from scripture when exactly these so-called zombies rose from the dead, but many would believe that it happened right when Jesus died. Well, that would make it problematic for Matthew to be able to write about it. Remember from the last chapter, all of the disciples were scared and they all fled. And Matthew, of course, is a disciple. So if he fled and these saints rose from the graves when Jesus died, Matthew wouldn't have been able to see it. So those are some of the main reasons why people can believe that this is a figurative, not a literal event. On the other side of the camp, those who believe that this did literally happen, they've got some good evidence too. Firstly, we don't know how many saints rose from the grave and walked on the streets. It could have been 5,000, it could have been 3. Nobody knows. So the claim that this didn't happen because non-biblical historians never wrote about it isn't that credible. It would be easy to be able to document a worldwide blackout, but a handful of saints walking down the street, it's much less likely that they would see an event like that. Another thought is this. When I imagine somebody raising from the grave, I think about somebody who's got like tattered clothes and tattered skin, and they look like a zombie. But the Bible gives no indication that that's what they looked like. I mean, if this was a miraculous event, it stands to reason that they could have been raised from the dead and look totally normal, like you and I look. The reason why I bring that up is because they could have been walking down the streets just like anybody else, and no one would know the difference. That's reasonably possible. And the final piece of evidence on the side that this was literal is the fact that Matthew is the author of this book. Now, we've covered in detail the first 26 chapters of Matthew, and one thing that is very consistent about his writing is that he is very literal. He doesn't write about any information that is unnecessary, but he doesn't exclude any information that is necessary. So the fact that Matthew mentions this in chapter 27 but does not go into much detail is totally typical of Matthew. That's kind of his writing style throughout the entire book. I think that either camp that you land on is totally reasonable. And the good news is that this is not a salvation issue. It's not like if I believe one way or the other, it's going to affect my relationship with Jesus or my salvation. So it really doesn't matter that much. For me personally, I tend to believe that this is a literal event. The reason why I believe that is because of how literal Matthew has been throughout writing the entire book. And also, he mentions this event around other events that we do know are literally true. So although I'm not 100% sold on it, I do tend to lean towards the zombies being real. Thank you so much for watching this entire episode of Learn the Bible with Nathan. I think my biggest takeaway from this chapter was actually Simon of Cyrene and how his kids were some of the early church leaders. I literally didn't know that until I started studying for this episode, so that was fun for me. In the next episode, we're going to go over Matthew chapter 28. This is the last chapter in the book of Matthew. But until then, Jesus loves you, and shalom, shalom.